Welcome. I'm Vivian Cox-Fraser, President and CEO of the Urban League of Essex County, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this session of the Governor's Conference on Housing and Economic Development, focused on race, diversity, and redevelopment. And we have a really dynamic panel here today of experts in the field, and we're really looking forward to hearing about their experiences and learning more about what they're doing. First, I'm going to introduce everyone briefly, and I'm going to start with the ladies first. Margaret Chinwe Anadu. She is currently the Global Head of Sustainability and Impact for Asset Management at Goldman Sachs. She's certainly leading the firm's development and oversight strategy for delivering commercial solutions and leading advisory services to clients related to inclusive growth and climate transition. She's also the chairwoman of the Urban Investment Group and co-chair of the Asset Management Sustainability Council. You certainly can read more of her bio. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Next, we have Karim Hudson, founding and managing member of Genesis. He founded Genesis in 2004, and under his stewardship at the Genesis Companies has grown rapidly into a full-service real estate development firm focused on the development of affordable and mixed income housing. Welcome, Karim.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Next, I'm really pleased to welcome Uche Osuji. He is currently managing director at Octeris Impact Investors, a privately held investment firm that invests in growth-oriented operating businesses and infrastructure projects located in underserved communities. Welcome, Mr. Osuji.
Pleasure to be here.
Next, I'm really happy to welcome George Ashton, Managing Director of Strategic Investments at Local Initiative Support Corporation, better known as LISC. George is the Managing Director in charge of leading LISC multidimensional effort, pursuing a high range of investments that create jobs, fuel small businesses, revitalize commercial areas, improve housing, and expand local incomes, and make communities safer and stronger. Welcome, George.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great. Well, thank you, all of our wonderful panelists. I'm going to start off with Margaret, if I can, and I'm going to ask each panelist this question to respond to this question. Really tell the audience about yourself and the impact of your company has had on redevelopment projects. I'm going to ask you to keep your answers brief to like less than 3 minutes so that we can get to everyone and get to really the meat of the panel today. Thank you. Margaret.
Thank you so much, Vivian. So as she mentioned, I'm Margaret Anadu, and I lead sustainability and impact here at Goldman. But I think more relevant to this conversation is the work that we've done in New Jersey through our Urban Investment Group. So we started investing in New Jersey. Our first investment was actually right there in Newark back in 2000. I believe this was 2009, and it's been an incredible ride. We started with a relatively small investment. It was just a few $1 million to renovate a movie theater in the Central Ward in Newark. And fast forward to today, we've actually deployed over $1 billion in communities like Newark, Camden, New Jersey, Jersey City. We actually just recently made a really great investment in Patterson. And our approach has been to really think about community development and economic development holistically. So we've invested a lot in housing. I mentioned our first investment was a movie theater. We've financed several high-performing schools for low-income students. We've financed grocery stores. We've put capital behind cultural facilities. And so our approach is really to think about all of the items that are needed in these communities to create socially thriving neighborhoods that really provide opportunities for families and residents. And so that's everything from where and how people live, to the jobs that they have access to the fresh food that they have access to. And our approach from an investing standpoint is to really provide the tools that people need. So we invest equity, we invest debt, we utilize tax credits, we do opportunity zone equity investing. And so we really try to approach the work from a really solutions oriented standpoint. And so, across the business, Goldman more broadly, sometimes our clients are, big Fortune 500 companies. And this work, we really think about the clients as the neighborhoods themselves. And so what we're trying to do is really pair really thoughtful and flexible capital with the stakeholder-driven approach and work together to revitalize New Jersey's communities, which I think, as everyone on this Zoom knows, are just incredibly dynamic. And with the right capital and the right focus, we can be doing even more for New Jersey's families.
Thank you, Margaret. Karim, maybe you can share a little bit about your background and interests.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. Genesis has been around, as we mentioned, since 2004. I'm actually one of my first deal was in Jersey City, 9% low-income housing tax credit. So I think we're well known to the agency and to the general state in terms of being developers of affordable housing. We really focused on mostly urban projects. So anywhere from a Jersey City to a East Orange to a Elizabeth and various other places where there's the need to really develop either mixed income or residential housing that is and mixed use housing that will help uplift communities. I like what Marcus said about communities are really our clients, and I think that couldn't be more true. I would say another aspect of our business is really focused on trying to preserve affordable housing. We do a lot of that in New York City. We do a lot of that also in New Jersey. We work with housing authorities and others who have affordability restrictions or affordability goals and focuses and try to help them to maintain, to preserve, to enhance and modernize that housing. We just did a project with the East Orange Housing Authority. It's about 200 units where we preserved some of their public housing, under the RAD program. So we're doing a lot of different things from mixed income to mixed use to rehab projects in New Jersey, and we're excited about the opportunity to do more.
Thanks, Karim. Uche.
Hi, everyone. Just briefly want to say Uche, born in West Africa. We moved here being Section 8 housing in Dallas when I was 8. While there, we were going to private parochial schools. And I provide that window into my personal journey because I believe it gives context to my personal lens and why I do the work I do. I had a chance to join our firm in May of 2014. We joined our place-based Michigan Fund, a partnership with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation and U.S. Treasury, whereby our focus was to provide capital to growing businesses that were in low-income tax. Post that fund, we have created that fund across places like Baltimore, Detroit, Erie, Pittsburgh, as you know, have large urban populations. As a result, 27% of our portfolio companies are certified minority owned. I would say that some of our work is beyond corporate finance. We just announced the first phase of our plan, which we have launched a partnership with Erie in Insurance to develop Erie's downtown. And just last week, we closed on a deal that opened a grocery store in a food desert in Baltimore, just to give a flavor of some of the deals that we're working on.
Great. Thanks, Uche. And George from LISC.
So thank you, George Ashton, President of LISC Fund Management. So I manage a group within LISC that manages impact funds. We are at this point at 7 funds and a little over $1 billion AUM. Those funds invest in real estate and affordable housing, but also business investments. A lot of them are place-based, so for a certain city. Some of them are national as well. LISC is a 40-year-old institution, huge institution, similar to what Margaret and Karim have talked about, really focused on preserving affordable housing. They have LISC Newark, which is where our office is in New Jersey, done 2,300 units of sort of condos and housing with an affordable focus, and continues to do a lot there. They also have a training program for developers that are looking to do affordable housing. So really in that preservation and the new construction space for affordable housing. Because the focus of this panel is also on racial equity, we're remiss not to mention that my group, LISC Fund Management, has a fund called the Black Economic Development Fund. It's a $250 million fund with a bunch of large corporates as its investors. And that fund invests in Black businesses, Black banks, and Black institutions. A lot of our deals have been with Black real estate developers. We found a really great niche in helping with acquisition, redevelopment, pseudo equity, and other sort of early stage capital needs these developers have for acquiring sites. And not all of it has been affordable. And I think there's a discussion to be had there. But there's been a mix of affordable and market rate, but all of it's creating jobs, which is really nice. So that's what we're excited about in this sort of affordable space. That's a national fund, but some of the work we do is in New Jersey. Thank you.
Great, thank you. You know, this panel really is around race, diversity, and redevelopment. And one of the things I want to explore with the panelists now is really, have you had to deal with racism as a developer? And if so, how did you deal with that situation? And I don't want to call on you, I'll let you just weigh in, because maybe everyone hasn't had this experience, but we'd love to hear from you.
Karim, you should go first.
Karim.
Okay, we are going to call on you.
He's a developer.
Like with the developer, that was my calling card, right?
Yeah.
Look, I mean, as we all know, racism comes in a lot of different forms, and it's not always in your face. So, I mean, I think the challenges that minority developers have experience in getting a fair share and a fair opportunity has not all been about capacity, as everybody talks about. I think the truth is that the opportunities have been presented equally, right? And so there hasn't been sometimes a fair chance to compete for those opportunities. And whether or not that's racism or other things can all be argued. But the bottom line is, I think what we need to see are more Black developers in markets competing for deals, getting financing, and successfully developing those projects. I think that's good for the market, that's good for communities, and that's good for affordable housing. So I think that's the way I would answer the question in terms of racism.
Yeah, I would add, having been a developer in the renewable energy space, but some of the same issues. Development's all about relationships, right? And so either having those relationships or being favored in those relationships can be affected by the color of your skin, just straight talk. So it's there. And then also what Karim said about the other aspect of racism is just the historic nature, right? So not having capital in your network, and so much of real estate development starts with friends and family or family money that get you going, right? And at some point, it's really hard to be successful in the space. Mine is just being a fee developer and affordable, even there, but it's certainly on the capital market side, it's hard to be successful without having some pocket of capital to work with. So that is a hindrance that's racially motivated, even historically.
Yes, so I'll hop in here, and obviously I do corporate finance, and the one example that comes to my mind is we were working with a Black man to buy this firm, and we were actually we thought we were moving on to work the term sheet. At a lunch with the seller's agent, the guy got quiet and shared with me that, first of all, went to high school with seller and that he knows him very well, and the guy isn't a racist, which obviously you kind of stand up there, or your flags go up. And this agent goes on to share with me that the seller did not feel comfortable selling to a Black man, and it wasn't about race, right? That he has owned this firm for over 25 years. Most of his employees had been with him for almost that time. And he just did not feel that his clientele would give him the same terms that they have. And he didn't want anyone to believe this was about race. It was about him trying to take care of his family, right? Which is how he viewed the 50 or so people that I share this to say, we're beyond where the racists are obvious, right? This gentleman, and I actually met him, is a normal, nice guy that goes to church every weekend, and he firmly believes that this view he has about not selling to a Black person, a 50-year-old manufacturing firm that cranks out 2.5 million worth of free cash flows every year, was not based. I share that to say that our challenges are hard, but we need to keep persevering. Obviously, with our buyer, we moved on, and I'm happy to report, we're in term sheet on deal that we hope will close by end of year. It is there, and we just have to keep moving.
So I see you said, let's just move on, right? So that deal didn't close, you're looking for another one. Do you find that to be a common theme, or was this just a one-off incident?
I just say, we don't know who is racist, who is not. We don't know. I only got a window into the seller's mindset because he happened to go to high school with his agent, and he felt comfort sharing all of his thoughts with him. And obviously the agent and I were close enough for him to like share that. That seller actually came back to me away from that first deal to see if I could help him with financing. If it had made sense in terms of other deal, I'm not sure if my firm would have or not, but our first mandate is to try to help whatever region that we're working on to maintain the jobs in their area, right? So,
and I'll just jump in on that. I don't think Uche was saying that we just need to move on. I mean, certainly, the way I think about it and the way Genesis approach it is that when we see inequities in the market, we speak out on them, and that isn't always embraced. And I have a reputation, Genesis has a reputation for speaking out on inequitable issues, and there are people who don't like that, and I get it, and I'm okay with that. So my point is that, like, for example, we talk about capacity as being limited. Well, if your equity platform, or what a municipality is asking for, or somebody who's RFPing land is asking for, is somebody to provide equity that's 15 years long and is 5% or 8% IRRs, below market IRRs, like there's only like a certain amount of people who'll be willing to do that type of deal, right? Like I can't go to Margaret and say, hey, take a 6% IRR and hold your money in for 20 years. I can't really go to the market with that, right? So you're looking at people who essentially have long-term family money, right? Who can put that type of cash into a deal and let it sit, right? And they have an incentive to do that for whatever reason it is, maybe it's tax and otherwise. That to me is an equitable strategy to have, right? Because you're basically cutting off the market, and my ability to be able to market a product if I was to win the RFP. So I think those are like market dynamics that we need to continue to take a look at, and we need to continue to speak out about and figure out in those situations how we need to level the playing field so that people can compete, and not just Black developers, all people can compete for deals and bring their talents to the table and be able to say, hey, here's what I can do, here's how I can do it, and here's why it makes sense. And not be excluded a priori based on terms that probably don't make much sense and are market terms.
Can I just add one thing to that quickly, because I feel like Karim touched on it and George did as well. I think people sort of appreciate the fact that African Americans and other minorities do not have the same access to capital that others do. And I think one thing that people forget about real estate, they understand high level, yes, this is a capital intensive business. I think what people forget is that Karim and others like him, they're not only looking for, the loan to buy the land, the equity to then go vertical with the building. They are then facing banks, funds, et cetera, all day long who say, okay, great. Thank you for raising all the capital that you need for this transaction. I would also like to see your bank statements where you have, 30 million liquid that I want you to just have just to feel good about the things that are going to happen, right? And so that is, I think, access to capital challenges in a way that are just compounded, that, not to be dramatic about it, but we're literally digging out of 400 years of being behind. Like the amount of developers, families, et cetera, that are Black in this country, generational wealth that is sitting there in a bank account to make banks and funds, et cetera, feel more comfortable, even after you've raised the capital to actually do the deal that's in front of you, is just a very limited number. And so I think Karim really hit it on the head about, and it's almost a merger of Uche's point. Okay, well, what does it look like to move forward? It looks like all of us, right, myself included, in our industry saying, okay, well, if this is what we're asking for, but we're also saying we want to do deals with women, with, Black, Latinx, et cetera, and we know that what we're asking for is not going to be reasonable, or certainly at least isn't going to be, prolifically available, then we all just have to change the game going forward. Or stop saying that we're going to change it, like it's one or the other. So.
All right, so you've all raised some really good points around the sort of point to the barriers facing getting development projects done, whether it's having to have guarantees or the equity. Not only you hear a lot about, well, you don't really have the capacity, right? Well, how do you get the capacity? It's sort of like you're in a catch-22 that you can't get out of. You need the capacity. Without doing the project, you don't get the capacity. So I guess maybe could each of you sort of speak a little bit to what do you see as sort of the greatest barrier? Is capital or lack of access to capital the greatest barriers to minorities gaining, access to development projects?
I had a question. I wanted to kind of like feed off what Margaret said, and maybe, I know George is here and Uche, you guys are providing financing. Like from an equity standpoint, Vivian, my question is an equitable standpoint. Like, is there a way, Margaret and Uche and George, to have banks, and would it help to have banks and financing institutions be more straightforward about what their definition of capacity is, right? Because I feel like, we go into these rooms and people say, oh, this person has capacity, that person does not have capacity. And it's hard, like, we learn in economics 101, like it's hard in a market where there's not free information flow for folks to understand what that means, right? And it allows for discrimination actually to occur more easily because people aren't straightforward with their terms, and banks aren't forced to say, okay, what term did you give X white developer versus what terms you're giving X black developer? And can you explain why you did that, right? And if they get up and say, hey, you know what, it's because we have a chummy relation with them, we play golf 5 times, right? Let's have them come out and say that, right? So how do we, does making banks and financial institutions more straightforward about what it is that how they are evaluating folks, is that going to be helpful? And is that something that you guys think we can accomplish?
I'll answer it in a few different ways. When you talk about that, it makes me think about the mortgage analysis that have been done with respect to like mortgage lending, and how you see all these studies come out that talk about the same application getting different rates from the same bank, et cetera. Could we apply something like that to commercial lending, right, in real estate, et cetera? I think it'd be very interesting. It wouldn't be perfect, right, because mortgages are more uniform than commercial lending. There's always 18,000 variables in a commercial deal. But I think it's a good effort to sort of bring up, because with our fund and the deals that we're doing, we're looking across different deals with different developers to make sure that we understand why we gave them different risk ratings and why we give them different rates and terms, why we required recourse on one, not the other, and trying to normalize that. I'm not sure everybody does that all the time the way they should. And the explicit question you asked, which is, what is capacity? How many units does someone have to do before we think that they're a good risk, right? In whatever asset class that they're in. And to Margaret's point earlier, when you talk about the barriers, yes, it's easy to lend to somebody that's got 70 million in liquid wealth, right? And you know that no matter what problem they get into, they can get out of. If you're not going to do that, then you have to lend based on experience and capabilities, right? And that gets to this question you asked, which is like, well, how many buildings do I have to do before I'm a good risk, right? Or how many people do I have to have on staff? Or what expertise do I have to have? So I think all of that transparency around all of that would be a great thing. I'm not sure how we get there, but I support the notion that you have.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I agree with the general premise that transparency and information is always helpful. Like people should know what they're dealing with. And I do know that some of my, peers in this space actually do have very, defined and clear boxes about, net worth and liquidity requirements and, years of experience, et cetera. We've actually found that if you approach, every developer, every project with the same, box, if you will, you're never going to get to equitable outcomes, right? So what we try to do is think about every single deal, every single sponsor relative to that moment, that risk, and the full context, right? So we might have a developer who is sitting on zero liquidity, right? But we can look at that transaction and that asset and what we think the real risks are, lease up risk, et cetera, how affordable it is, what are the other stakeholders around it, is the city and it is the state and et cetera, and say, you know what, we think that this project, even without the more traditional net worth constraints, et cetera, that someone might be looking for, is still going to make sense for us. And maybe there's some other bells and whistles, relationships, et cetera, that we can put around it to de-risk it. But I do think, Karim, that just because someone can say, I give these exact terms to this white developer and this Black developer, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get to equitable outcomes. Because if you have I'll give an example, a joint venture equity program where you require that every single developer, regardless of race, creed, religion, age, region, puts up 25% of the equity, that's not going to get you equitable outcomes. You're still going to have less minority developers because you're putting on constraints, given the context that we've all discussed, right? You're not going to get to the same place. So I think transparency is great, but I think we have to go even beyond that.
I mean, I guess you're absolutely right, Margaret, and I appreciate the point. Also, George, I mean, I guess the question is the risk profile of the deals, right? If we're doing 9% LIHTC deals or heavily subsidized deals, right? Are banks exaggerating the risk of the deal? And is it equitable for deals that are essentially heavily financed by public entities that you should require, I'm not saying you do, Margaret, or you do, George, like $30 million in cash, right? Like, is there a discussion to be had once everybody puts their cards on the table to say, why are banks requiring this much liquidity when public entities are throwing in X amount of millions of dollars, right? And they have an interest in seeing equitable outcomes in terms of development community. So, I mean, to me, that's where the conversation should go at some point, because it feels to me like maybe the private market is creating risk that's not there, given a lot of their risk is subsidized by public entities in these deals.
Absolutely agree.
I will weigh in and say, obviously, I definitely agree with the other panelists said, and would only add that we can only manage what we track, obviously, and totally think we should make it so that banks must report what percent of loans that they are given to BIPOC to develop real estate. And then we should not just stop there, but move on to pension funds, and then move on to firms like mine and say all impact funds should be poured out. What are the percentage of deals we are doing with BIPOC? Obviously, we are proud. We are working to go beyond that. And, I was happy, obviously, when George shared the fund that his firm is working on right now. Similarly, we're talking to two money center banks right now to create programs that will also focus on BIPOC firms.
Thank you. So, well, you've all raised some really strong points around some of the barriers that you face as minority developers. Let me ask you, what do you think around for doing work in distressed communities? What tools do you suggest for actually being in the room for the development projects? I mean, so I think you mentioned it, Karim. Like, one, if you're not in the room, you don't know what's going on. You don't know what other deals are being made. You're left sort of on the outside looking in, trying to knock on the door and say, let me in. What kind of tools have you utilized to make sure you're at those tables?
So look, I mean, I think somebody said, it might have been George, like relationships are key. I mean, I've known Margaret for a long time. We've never actually done much together, but we always talk about stuff. We talk about things that are happening in the industry. And, I was talking to one of the folks that works in her group, and he was telling me about some deals that were happening in different markets and how I could potentially lend some expertise. And, to me, look, Genesis has been around for 15 plus years. So we're in a different, we haven't quite gone to ultra level, like in real estate, that's not so many years, but we've been quite a while, and people know us in the market and know that we can perform. So I think we're always talking to people. We're always out there, focusing on, here's what we're looking at. Here's what we can do. What do you guys see? And trying to get constant feedback. I mean, and I also think, like, as developers, a little bit different than being financing folks, like, getting low, getting in the weeds, understanding where things are happening, and understanding markets and understanding places where you want to be, right? Because I think when I first started, I literally used to travel from Harvard Business School down to the community board meetings in Harlem. And I used to sit there and listen to what was happening. And I would go back up to Boston and Cambridge. I mean, that's how I got my first deal. And that's how I met my first employers. They were working on a deal on Fifth Avenue, 116th Street, and I met them at a community board meeting because I was sitting there listening as a student. So I understood quickly what was happening, what was going on in that neighborhood. You know, when I did my first deal, Web Apartments in Jersey City, you know, I hooked up with a community woman who took me around in Ward F neighborhood that needed a lot of redevelopment, and we sat around and looked at properties, looked at what was happening here and what was happening there. And then, you know, we networked our way to kind of say, hey, you know what, here's something that we think is developable. What are you guys doing? Oh, we're not doing anything. Well, here's why you should do it with us. And don't be afraid to get in and make that pitch. You know, I don't allow any thoughts about racism to interfere with my aggressiveness and trying to go after deals. If I have something I want to bring to Anu, to Margaret, or I want to bring to George or Uche, I'm going to say, hey guys, here's a deal I want you to do. Doesn't matter how much we've done in the past, and here's why you should do it with Genesis. And guess what? They all open the door and listen. So, you know, I remember I came to Margaret with something I wanted her to refinance. We didn't get the deal done, but she came and opened the door, regardless of, you know, how much experience we had together with her. So I expect that people are going to always open the door and listen, because their job is actually to do deals as well. So that's the way I think about it. And that's how we approach it. And then whenever we need to speak out on issues that we feel like don't make sense, you know, we'll do that. And we'll try to work collaboratively, not in a gotcha moment, but in a collaborative effort to say, look, we think this is an issue. This is why we think it's an issue. We think it's reasonable. And here's our explanation. And we think you should make some changes. And I think all that is a very reasonable approach to how you should approach the market.
Yeah. Can I add to that? Because I feel like in a lot of these conversations, there can almost be this like deficit narrative around diversity. Like, how do we get Black developers, you know, to the table? How do we, you know, get them in the room? Like, but I think what's missing is actually, and people, you know, they ask us this a lot because we're all on a journey. We have a lot more to do. We should be doing even, you know, more and more financing and work with minority developers. But I am proud of our team's track record, and we've deployed billions with Black developers, and we're proud of that, and we'll continue to do that. I think sometimes people are surprised when they say, oh, how do you do that? And why do you do that? Like, first of all, like, it's commercially driven, right? If you think about the high level concept, which I feel like we've all hopefully finally gotten on board with, that diverse ideas, diverse teams, a diverse set of perspectives will drive out performance. And then you bring that down to the level, not just of real estate development and communities, but specifically so many of these neighborhoods that we're talking about, especially in New Jersey that we're working on, these are Black and brown communities. So if you think about the fact that these developers who, and I don't want to generalize, might have a personal experience, even, you know, what Uche described earlier in the conversation about how sort of he came to this work, the relationships on the ground, et cetera, that's a key for our performance. That's a leg up on these things. And so I think it's, you know, part of it, I get the whole sort of how do we get to the table? But Black developers are the table. Like we're talking about communities that these teams, these organizations, these companies are built out of, typically, you know, hired disproportionately from. And so that's a benefit, that's a competitive advantage. And so I think once we can all recognize that, and, you know, I think Karim does a good job sort of pounding the table for himself, but I think other developers could also, you know, speak about why investing with them, you know, for them, alongside them is not just, you know, the right moral thing to do, it's the commercial and economic thing to do, and it is good business. I think that's a really important point.
All right. Thank you. As we close out the session, because I want to be respectful of everybody's time and making sure we cover a range of topics. You know, capacity has come up quite a bit in discussions, and it comes up at development tables all the time, right? So you see some developers, they have a team of like 4 people. That's not huge capacity. You know, you've got a team of 4 people. If I have a team of 4 people, how come my 4 people don't get the deal, right? So I guess I'd like to have you sort of speak a little bit about capacity issues that you do see, and what's the impact on development in communities of color. I'm going to ask George to take this question because LISC really has a role in building the capacity of our organizations and institutions and communities as their core mission. So George, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be to the point. it's as an investor in real estate, capacity is important and critical. Things go wrong on projects. You have to have the ability to have oversight of those projects. We sort of look at the amount or the number of projects you're taking on versus your capacity to understand how much attention you can pay to each project. And we've had situations with any race of developer where they were short of capacity and it cost the project something because it just wasn't being monitored appropriately. So I would say the flip side of capacity is just measured growth, right? Making sure that you can provide a high quality experience for your investors as a developer as you sort of build your real estate portfolio. So I think that, that capacity discussion to me is not different for Black and brown developers than it is for white, because everyone needs to have adequate capacity. I think the bigger question is, how do you get there, right? And that's with retained earnings, right? If you can make money or have equity positions that are growing in value and you can reinvest that in your firm, you can easily grow capacity. Affordable housing fee development is a good business, but it can be a hard way to build a larger real estate development company, which is why I'm proud that we are sort of taking the foray beyond that affordable space into other types of development opportunities for Black and brown developers. I think it does more to help them build that capacity in the long run. The last thing I'll say is, because the most important thing to me is not making a developer wealthy, but that developer creates jobs in the community for folks in his company, but also subcontractors. Look for diversity in subcontractors as well. So that's my real goal, which is why capacity is important to me.
Yeah, I agree with everything George said. And I would just say, from our perspective, I've always argued that building capacity is about giving Black developers more deals, because to Margaret's point, that's the commercial incentive, right? People want to finance deals, right? So if we're designating Black developers, we're giving them access to projects and they're getting those projects, the market can figure out how to get that financed, right? And hopefully they'll JV all of that equity away, but they're keeping that equity and they're able to get the projects done with the help of folks like, George and others who are on this call, and folks who are really committed to trying to make and finance these type of development opportunities.
Uche, I was going to turn it over to you to speak a little bit about capacity. I know you're doing some different type of financing around financing actual businesses as opposed to financing the real estate development projects. Maybe you could weigh in a little bit about the capacity you see that needs to be added and how.
I would say that obviously capital is a barrier in our realm, but also it's just what we found is trying to make sure that our Black business folk are aware that the deals are happening, right? So they're not even aware that the game is being played. So how can they ever score? So most of that we do, and we have some great partners, is to make sure that we are funneling that data to, for instance, in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, a group called President's Council, which is the leading Black business folks from that region who do have the funds to maybe play a role. It's more trying to make sure that they have access to that data.
We're going to wrap up our panel today. I was wondering if anyone has any closing remarks they'd like to give. I really want to open it up for everyone to be able to give some closing thoughts. Karim, I'll start with you.
I mean, I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate the frankness and openness, and hopefully this is helpful to folks. And by the way, if folks want to reach me, I'm on LinkedIn. You can just use my name, Karim Hudson. Happy to hear from you.
I'll go next. George Ashton at List. You can reach me there or find me online. But just excited to see this topic as a topic for the panel. And the folks here, it's not an easy thing we're trying to do. And so good to see the success stories as a way for giving me more energy to continue the fight.
Yeah, I would also echo that and say I am excited at all of the focus, but it is really important that we don't let this focus over the past 2 years drop, right? When you see all of the Fortune 500 corporations that have announced very large programs focused on us, it is important that we keep this momentum moving, and we would love to work with anyone who wants to reach out to to help us drive minority ownership in the corporate sector.
Well, thank you all, and we're looking forward to taking questions from the audience. So thank you, and let's get the next questions going.